My name is Adoni Melifopoulos, and thanks for coming out to this afternoon's panel titled The Politics of Work. The event is hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society here at Oregon State University. And for those of you who don't know Platypus, we're a campus-based group, and we were established in Chicago in 2006. We organize reading groups, public fora, research and journalism, focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. Now, although this is the first in-person panel we've hosted since the pandemic, it's the sixth that we've had here in Corvallis. And if you find this panel intriguing and like to help us host this conversation at OSU, Huang has a sign-up sheet. I think I know many of you, but if you're not signed up and I'd like to do some of this, that'd be great. In addition to panels, our chapter is regularly generating submissions for the free journal, the Platypus Review, which is available monthly across campus. I know Interzone is one place that we put them regularly. I noticed on campus things kind of get picked up pretty quick and put in the custodial get it. But anyways, we have a new issue out. It's right there, issue 150. Just came out. We host a weekly reading group Tuesdays at 5 p.m. in the Valley Library, and a weekly meetup to talk about current events, ideas, politics, and history on Monday at 5 p.m. at the Memorial Union Lounge across from the Bites convenience store. Finally, we have a podcast titled Shit Platypus Says, the commentary on the commentary of the left, which is available on SoundCloud and iTunes. It's a great way to stay in touch with platypus activities and engagements around the world. So join us. Now let's begin. Let me begin by introducing our panelists. I'm so excited. This is a great panel that's based here in the Willamette Valley of people thinking about this topic from various perspectives. So we have Zachary Field. Zachary is an organizer on the first Starbucks Workers United organizing committee formed in Buffalo, New York during the fall of 2021. He's a graduate student in the Water Resource Policy and Management program here at OSU and studies the use of collective action and labor movements to respond to environmental issues. Next, we have Randy Taylor. Randy is currently the organizing department liaison for the Mid-Valley Industrial Workers of the World, coordinating between national and local organizers on matters of workplace unionization. Their work on the left has included tenants organizing, labor organizing, and mutual aid projects. They're also currently a PhD student in robotics at Oregon State University. And then beside Randy, there's Devin Lawson McCourt, who's the chair and co-founder of the Socialist Students for Peace and Freedom. They are a sophomore at Mackenzie River Community School and are currently involved with the Peace and Freedom Party. Their main objective is to create a broad left coalition that is independent of the Democratic Party. Let me begin by reading the panel prompts that all the participants have been thinking about their remarks around. It began with 3 quotes. The first one's from Frederick Jameson, who Tony recently reminded me was here at OSU in the 1980s. Capital is not a book about politics, and not even a book about labor. It's a book about unemployment. The next quote is from Joan Robinson. The misery of being exploited by capitalists is nothing compared to the misery of not being exploited at all. The final quote's by Andre Gortz. The error consists in believing that labor, by which I mean heteronymous, salaried labor, can and must remain the essential matter. It's just not so. According to the American projections, within 20 years, labor time will be less than half of that of leisure time. I see the task of the left as directing and promoting this process of the abolition of labor in a way that will not result in mass unemployment on one side, an aristocracy of labor on the other, and between them a proletariat which carries out most distasteful jobs for 45 hours a week. Instead, let everyone work much less than for his salary and thus be free to act in a much more autonomous manner. Today, communism is a real possibility and even a realistic proposition, for the abolition of salaried labor through automation saps both capitalist logic and the market economy. It's generally assumed that Marxists and other leftists have political responsibility to support reforms for improvement of the welfare of workers. Yet, leading figures from the Marxist tradition, such as Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, also understood that such reforms would broaden the crisis of capitalism and potentially intensify contradictions that could adversely impact the immediate conditions of workers. For instance, full employment, while being a natural demand from the standpoint of all workers' interests, also threatens the conditions of capitalist production, which rely on a surplus of available labor, thereby potentially jeopardizing the system of employment altogether. In light of such apparent paradoxes, the panel today is going to investigate the politics of work from leftist perspectives. It's going to attempt to provoke in your minds reflection on and discussion of the ambiguities and dilemmas of the politics of work by including, we have speakers here today from divergent perspectives, some of whom might seek the immediate abolition of labor and others whom seek to increase the availability of employment opportunities. We're hoping that this conversation is going to deepen the understanding of the contemporary problems faced by the left in its struggle to construct a politics adequate to the self-emancipation of the working class. So without the guidelines. So panelists have 12 minutes for opening remarks. After that, there'll be an opportunity to respond to one another. They promised to keep them focused, but one or two points of agreement or disagreement with other panelists before handing it off to you for Q&A and discussion. If you are online, please add your questions and comments in the Q&A box, and Will over there will read your question out loud. We promised to conclude at 5 p.m. sharp, so at about 4:40, I'm going to cut the questions off and allow the panelists to make some concluding remarks and reflections on the panel. And I think afterwards, if it's not too crazy, we may head over to American Dream to continue the conversation. Okay. Zach, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks for putting this together and giving us such a thought-provoking prompt. I guess we were tasked with considering the ultimate fate of work in a world in which technology is constantly restructuring our relationship to production. And I'm afraid I find myself in a position to offer little in the way of critical insight on this subject. I lack both the strong familiarity with theory as well as the kind of empirical grounding that I think would be helpful in attempting to make a novel contribution in thinking about these kinds of questions. But what I can offer are maybe some anecdotal observations about how the technological developments and economic trends that we're discussing today have shaped my experience working and organizing in the food service industry, and I can provide some thoughts on how our changing work environment presents a new set of challenges as well as opportunities for organized labor. So during my time working at Starbucks, I encountered a workplace where, as is typical in much of the world, workers were constantly being tasked with doing more, right? Adopting more responsibilities, assuming a more rapid pace of work, and incorporating more skills into their daily work routines, all while being compensated at essentially the same rate. Some of the industries where we've seen the most high-profile private sector pushes for unionization, places like Amazon and Starbucks, are workplaces where technology has enabled new and increasingly invasive forms of surveillance and monitoring. At Amazon Warehouse, for instance, apps are installed on workers' private devices to track their every movement on the shop floor and alert workers and managers alike when they're deemed to be spending too much time off task from their workstation or taking too long to use the bathroom. At Starbucks, we worked under a timer where cars spending in excess of 30 seconds at the drive-thru window risked flagging us for work inefficiencies, while metrics under such names as customer satisfaction scores tabulated our effectiveness in simulating meaningful human relationships. These are local manifestations of a national trend. According to the Economic Policy Institute, between 1979 and 2019, net productivity among U.S. workers grew nearly 60%, but during that same time, median worker compensation grew only by 15.8%. As an example, I experienced that is representative of the increasing demands placed on workers. During the pandemic, even when transaction volumes at stores plummeted, Starbucks still posted record quarterly revenue, buoyed by increasingly complicated and expensive drink orders. Mobile technology in the form of ordering apps like Uber Eats, social media trends spread on forums such as TikTok, and corporate marketing strategies all combine to increase the demands and workload placed on us, allowing employers to extract additional surplus labor and ensure record profits. So So in both these workplaces, Amazon and Starbucks, workers are thought of as being reproducible and disposable as the parts of the machines that we operate. And this churn and burn mentality presents a massive challenge to labor organizers, but it also sets the context for the service industry in our present moment. When I think about the task before organized labor in responding to the challenges of the current day, I believe our priority absolutely must be to enhance the unity of purpose of the working class and build worker power by growing the movement and expanding union density in the private sector. We have seen some exciting sources of revitalization and momentum in recent waves of union petitions across the country, but we must be sober and realistic in our analysis. The private sector unionization rate in this country is currently 6% and has been declining year over year. And despite public approval for unions being at their highest since 1965, our union leadership and organizations seem to lack the necessary vision and mentality needed to rise to the moment. Allow me to read to you from a story in this month's labor notes that I think presents some of the dysfunctions we must overcome to effectively organize in today's economy. This is what a campaign of grassroots organizers in a Lansing Chipotle encountered when they tried to unionize their shop. Before they talked with, quote from the article, before they talked with any unions about affiliating, the Chipotle workers in Lansing started holding union meetings. One of the most consequential votes was on which union to affiliate with. Organizing committee leaders researched different unions, both locally and nationally, and reached out wherever they could. Some never called back. Some said it was outside of their geography or jurisdiction. One thing that wasn't expected was that we actually got turned down or left on read, said one organizer. It was really frustrating for a while. We were wondering what was wrong with us. They also had a call to discuss affiliating with the industrial workers of the world, who advised them to skip the board and contracting process and focus instead on shop floor actions, end quote. So eventually these workers connected with Teamsters Local, who took them more seriously. But I think here we have an instance of what I think is a real problem, right? At 6% union density, the fact that unions can be turning away any interested worker or worrying about these parochial jurisdictional battles is absolutely absurd. And with all due respect to any WAVs that I might be sharing the table with today, I cannot count how many nascent union campaigns I've seen fail because workers have turned to this organization with its admittedly venerable history, but absolutely inadequate organizing capacity in the present day. We must adopt the mentality that no workplace is too small to unionize and every victory is significant. For Alexander Berkman, the true purpose of the union must be to enlighten its members about their condition, to show them why and how they are robbed and exploited. Well, that's all well and good, but it's my contention that that is not the issue of it is not an issue of class consciousness that unions must arouse in workers today. For I believe most workers viscerally understand the great injustice and indignity of toiling at poverty wages while the bosses make more off of their labor than a person could spend in a lifetime. No, instead, I think our task should be to show workers that they have the power to resist the current social political order of the world and that they can build a better future. But to do this, we must win, and we must demonstrate the power of our collective voice, something that I feel is most readily achieved through contract bargaining. We need to demonstrate that unions can improve the material conditions of workers, and we should not cling to outmoded revolutionary dogmas that impede our ability to win these improvements. As we build our union movement, we need leaders who are willing to devolve power back to workers, a union movement that gives primacy to worker autonomy and allows them to lead. What I have learned is that the act of participating in a union drive and the self-discovery of empowerment and agency is itself a radicalizing experience. We need to trust workers in their read on the unique dynamics of their individual workplaces, and we need to keep in mind that every union campaign, victory or defeat, is an accomplishment in the fact that it has trained a new generation of labor activists who will take their newfound skills and experiences and bring them to every future workplace they inhabit. It is the sense of dignity and self-worth that is one of the greatest contributions that unions can enable workers to experience. The discovery of that dignity through resisting the tyranny of the workplace dictatorship is a key part of the personal transformation that unions should try to galvanize in their members. And while the discovery of our collective voices is a seriously empowering experience, unions also carry the potential to awaken our imaginations as well, and can help us envision all we stand to gain. Just learning about what other union baristas had won and all that we could ask for was a kind of awakening for me personally. When I first learned that baristas at Spot Coffee, which was a local franchise in Buffalo that had unionized earlier with Workers United, had won wage increases, paid sick leave, tip credits, unlimited 5-minute breaks at workers' discretion, my mind started to explore all sorts of previously unimaginable possibilities. That we could fight not only for better wages, but a more humane work environment that respected our human needs, and eventually, to fight for a workplace managed and owned by the workers themselves, suddenly seemed like a real possibility. The act of being part of a worker-led movement carries the potential to awaken our radical imaginations and can help us envision a new emancipatory future. In addition to growing our movement and increasing private sector union density, I believe we need to adopt an outlook that is more international orientation. Our globalized world calls for global linkages among workers to fight increasingly mobile forms of international capital. Solidarity between workers in adjacent industries and between workers in the periphery producing raw materials, all the way to workers at point of service delivery, each of them possess a unique form of leverage that can only be optimized for maximum effect when coordinated with workers globally. Technology may have redefined our relationship to production, but it has also opened new apertures for action. Increasingly automated workplaces give those workers with technical knowledge and maintenance skills outsized power through potential work stoppages and industrial sabotage. The drive to increase efficiency through make-to-order manufacturing models and the increasing length and complexity of our supply chains has multiplied the number of choke points that can cripple an industry. And the ability for workers to communicate and collaborate across distances has also grown. It is true today that we are facing an advanced stage of capitalism that has sinuated itself into every corner of the globe, and that technological innovations have been displacing workers at a rapid pace, with even the kind of creative brain work that has traditionally been considered to be immune to these disturbances under threat. But I feel that this has been accompanied by a blossoming of worker consciousness and a new clarity of vision about the contradictions and unsustainability of our current system. The task before us today is to build power among the working class and demonstrate its strength. Once we have regained our voice, we can return to the vital work of articulating our ultimate demands.
Thank you very much. Randy.
So, Naomi Klein said something in a lecture once that really stuck with me, and that was, only when we have the courage to tell the truth about our old stories will the new stories arrive to guide us. She was talking about stories we tell ourselves about the natural world and how it affects environmentalism, but I think it really applies to the stories we tell ourselves about unions and how it affects class struggle. So I want to talk a bit about what those stories are, why I think a lot of people carry with them a story of unions that's very limiting, and some alternative stories and some words of caution. So in my work with the IWW, or the industrial workers of the world, I meet a lot of people who are very pro-union. They know that statistically a union is going to give them better pay, it's going to give them better working conditions, and they want one for their workplace. However, they have this concept of unions that's very legalistic. So they may think, okay, I have the right to form a union by having a union election. And once I have one, the government requires that my employer negotiate with us and my union can win things for me. And I think this is limiting in two ways. First, it provides no insight as to how to actually get to that union election. The union campaigns are often a long and grueling process. And I meet so many people who are discouraged and disheartened, and they tell me that their workplace is unorganizable because they had this expectation that they were going to go from whatever their current workplace environment was to a full legally sanctioned union with nothing in between. And that's not realistic, and I hate seeing that frustration that it gives people. The other reason why it's limiting is that if policy is the basis of your union, then changes in policy can completely erode your power in the workplace, which is exactly what we see in the US. So only 12 years after the Wagner Act, which established the National Labor Relations Board and offered the first protections for union organizers, We see the Taft-Hartley Act, which outlaws a wide variety of union tactics and narrows what's considered an unfair labor practice. Then we see right-to-work laws that limit what workers can even propose in their contracts to their employers. And if you want to keep your legal recognition as a union, you have to comply with all of these new laws, which means not using some of the most powerful tactics unions have used historically, and unions are even required to punish workers for using those tactics. So, before I move on also to other stories, I want to acknowledge that even though this story is limiting, it's a source of comfort for a lot of people. So for me, growing up in the US, my K through 12 education told the story of the labor movement that was very focused on the idea of rights. So workers wanted more rights, they fought for these rights, the government granted them those rights, and now we have a better society because we have them. And changing our stories about unions also requires we change these myths about our history and about who we are. And it's uncomfortable for people to sit with, who am I as an American if the Wagner Act wasn't a great victory, if it was just an appeasement maneuver by a desperate administration in a time where there were multiple general strikes going on. So for some people, changing stories means grieving, and I get that. I think we should all make space for that. So what's a better story? I think that's something we all have to decide together, collectively. However, I will offer my conception of unions as some possible inspiration for that discussion. So a union, to me, is when a group of people work together to change a power dynamic that affects them personally. And this roughly aligns with what the IWW calls solidarity unionism. In your workplace, your boss or your company has a power over you that is unjust. And a labor union is when you challenge that power dynamic through collective action. In Legally Blonde, when all of the law interns get together and they oust Callahan, the lawyer, that's a union. No election needed. This definition also applies outside of the workplace. Tenants unions exist. They challenge the power dynamic between people who own property and people who need to rent for housing. Transit riders unions exist. They challenge the power dynamic between those who own and control transit systems and those who need transportation. And hopefully you're starting to see a pattern here that all of these power dynamics are deeply intertwined with class. So it's always this tension between those who own and control what everyone needs, and those who don't own and control the things that they need, and so they're in a position to be exploited. I do think there is still a danger to solidarity unionism, and that is that things can become about the union instead of about justice. I think we see this more on the statist left, where party loyalty tends to supersede all else. Party loyalty is the reason why I personally stopped joining any party-building projects. I think it's problematic on both the political level, where people outside of the party become viewed as disposable, and I think it's a problem on a personal level, where people are asked to sacrifice their well-being for the sake of some project. We even had an incident within the IWW. So the way this plays out on the libertarian left tends to be as union loyalty instead of as party loyalty. And we had an incident where someone outed a worker to her boss because he thought she was bad for the union. And that's just despicable behavior. Luckily, in the Mid-Valley branch, we make it very clear and affirm that our first loyalty is to each other and not to any abstraction. If someone has to work all day for the union, we don't ask them to sacrifice. We buy them lunch and we check in on them. And the most important thing that I really want to stress is that if the IWW stopped aligning with our values, we would withdraw. So I started with a favorite quote of mine, and I want to offer one more favorite quote by Jean Genet, which is, unfortunately, I don't think we can win without the red and black flags. But they must be destroyed afterwards. I think this is the attitude we all need to adopt, and we need to ask ourselves on both the individual and the organizational level all the time, who is this for and what is this for? And if the answer isn't for all people and for justice, then that work needs to cease. I highly encourage anyone who is hearing about solidarity unionism for the first time in this room to look into it. I think that it is both a system that challenges class in the way I was talking about before, that it is directly addressing tensions that come from class and capitalism, and something that allows us to all practice the democracy that a better society needs to be based on. I also encourage you to think about how it can be made better, how we can deal with problems like union loyalty. I said at the beginning we need news stories. Solidarity unionism certainly wasn't invented in 2022, but whatever is floating around in your head after this panel might be. So, thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to everyone who showed up today. I know that there's a game just down the block, so it's greatly appreciated that you're here. Throughout the history of the socialist movement, we know that a lot of it was sparked by labor and the rights of workers. And that is sort of how socialism sparked, and why we believe as socialist students for peace and freedom within the Peace and Freedom Party, that uplifting the worker and making sure that their work environment is as amazing as possible is our number one priority. The Peace and Freedom Party, which is used to be a nationwide party, is now just in California. We are feminist socialists. We often have a good working relationship with the Greens and PSL, and we hope to expand that relationship into Oregon, creating a relationship with the Pacific Greens and PSL PDX. And we believe that, well, it's not a belief, it's quite literally a fact, that currently a huge majority of people only perceive labor as work under capitalism. And capitalism actively harms people, as we know. Large unemployment rate, lots of people in poverty, and it's a big issue that liberalism kind of solves in a half-assed way, and we want to make sure that everyone is uplifted and we can push forward initiatives to end poverty and make sure that everyone has a home and a good working environment and wages that will actually be useful. We believe that workers should have a 30-hour work week with 40-hour pay, because right now the pay that the minimum wage creates and other people's jobs where they're just making $60K a year, that's certainly not enough to live off of, and it's absolutely absurd. And so we want to make sure that everyone can afford what they need to, and that workers aren't struggling.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists for your opening remarks. This is an opportunity for the panelists to respond to one another. And I guess, just thinking about Devin's comment in light of Randy and Zach, I think Zach expressed a frustration that, unions today let opportunities slip, and radical unions lack the capacity to take up these opportunities as well. That both ends, there seems to be a missing part. And Randy, you brought up the issue of there's a reason why existing unions may let the opportunity slip, and that there needs to be some attempt through solidarity unionism to be able to break through, with kind of having the immediate experience of gaining power kind of being the focal point. And Devin, you brought up the party, which I felt that both, I thought in Zach's opening remarks of I can't remember exactly how you put it, but the old models have to be kind of transcended somehow. And then Randy's comments about like the party itself, being the legacy of it in sort of labor legislation being kind of like, the dooming point. So I'd love to respond to whatever points you have, but those are the things that I heard amongst the conversation to me that sort of signaled kind of points of agreement and disagreement and also something more. Do you want to go in the same direction?
I think I'm still formulating some thoughts if you have any.
Okay.
I was just very surprised with your story that had to do with the IWW, because we actually have like a whole education department that runs trainings, and one of those trainings, the one that most people take, is Organizer Training 101. It has like an hour dedicated to why you need to get people that you want to work with a red card, that you need to make them feel like you should affiliate as soon as you can to make people feel supported. So it's crazy to me that the IWW dropped the ball on that and didn't get people red cards. But it might have been right of them to say not to do a union election, right? Like that. It seems like those workers took that advice poorly, but it might be because of what I was talking about with this expectation of going straight to having a union election, and they might not have been at the level of union maturity where they could run like an effective inoculation campaign. It might have been that a union election at that time seemed inadvisable because it was going to be really weak to a union busting campaign. So that's my thought process when I hear that story.
I mean, I can tell you that personally, it was a story that resonated with me a lot. I was a grocery store worker for a long time as a youth, and I know that when I wanted to organize my workplace, I called the only union that I really knew about, which was the IWW, because of its incredible revolutionary history. And essentially, I was told like, "Wow, that sounds ambitious. Good luck," And I've heard that story told many times, so I don't think it's atypical. I definitely agree with you that we need to be sober and strategic and cautious in our organizing campaigns, right? The employers have so much power. The asymmetries are tremendous. But I think I personally have some concerns about what the model of solidarity unionism will produce if it's not oriented toward concrete bargaining goals, right? And if we're focused on shop floor actions and things like that, to what end, right? Is my first question. And then I also worry that if these actions aren't consolidated and intentional and working towards something and building power, that they can lead to disillusionment, and that they can lead to a feeling of disempowerment, right? And that's my biggest concern.
So my question to you is, why does a goal have to be represented in a contract? Like, why are other forms of change within the workplace not as valid as something that's encoded in a contract? Because to me, having worker power backing you up, we'll do it again if you take away the thing, seems much stronger as a defense than a contract. And also, broadens the range of what you can do because you're not constrained to the limits of labor law.
Yeah. Do you have thoughts? Do you want to respond?
I would disagree with that. Contracts are between the union and the employer are very powerful. I'd say that it's a well-written document that can be used in court. And it basically shows that, hey, we agreed to this. You're not upholding your agreement here. We're going to have some issues. And because it's in Word and you signed it, we're going to, deal with this the legal way, or, you can step up and do what you promised to do. And so I would say the contracts are much more useful.
I don't want to discount contracts as a tool,
Okay.
but I don't see why they have to be the only tool in the toolbox.
That's fair.
Zach, do you want to have a chance and then we'll to respond? I think we've had a...
Yeah, no, I think that's fair, and it certainly shouldn't be our exclusive aim, right? I think we shouldn't discount the value of having a tangible document, right? Just as a symbolic representation of a worker's accomplishment, right? And their collective capacity to affect change. I think that's one thing. And two, I'm concerned that when we don't articulate our victories and our expectations through a contract, we're consigning ourselves really to an endless fight of industrial shop floor actions, right? And we shouldn't be overly sanguine in the efficacy of shop floor actions, right? I think something that is this going out? Who's going to be able to see this recording?
The world.
Okay. So, I'm just trying to think. I think one of the things that we're confronting as Starbucks organizers, right, is we've had explosive growth, right, where we just had over 250 stores win their elections, and still we're fighting against a corporation with over 9,000 corporately owned locations, right? And so even if we, focus on these kind of industrial actions and coordinate really, with the utmost intention and discipline, let's be honest, that's not going to impact Starbucks' bottom line in a way that's going to force them to accede to any of our demands. So we're going to have to be utilizing more tools, and then we need to have something to represent our gains.
Okay, I'm sure these topics are going to come up again. I just want to see if there are any questions or comments from the audience. We've been formulating them, or from the online audience.
There is one from the online.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I can read it. It's from Steve Roberts. The working class had organized and fought for 200 plus years. We still live in capitalism and continue to be exploited. But that exploitation is only part of the problem. The larger problem is the social force of capital that dominates all sections of society. To go beyond and remove the irreconcilable contradictions of capital in society requires a transformative political force by the mass of society. Are, should, and can trade unions be a vehicle to achieve that, or can they only address exploitation in the workplace? So that's by Steve Roberts.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Anybody want to take that up? So this issue of...
Could you repeat the question part?
I guess it's kind of a long question, but basically Steve Roberts seems like he's trying to focus on capitalism and saying that even if you increase the condition of the worker in the workplace, we still live under capitalism. Therefore, can trade unions be a vehicle that can, achieve a transformation beyond capitalism, or can they only address exploitation in the workplace?
A brief little thing here that industrial unions are different from trade unions because they organize along industry and not along trade. So that's why we're the industrial workers of the world. I think to transition to a more just system, it's going to take a complex ecosystem of tactics and organizations. And I think industrial unions and pressure unions are some of the best tools to do that with. And there was one more point. Can you repeat?
It's a very long question.
Yeah, it was a very long question.
Just to not repeat the whole thing. Capitalism, trade unions.
Oh, the working conditions. That's what we said. So I object to that as the goal, right? You want to change the location of power, take it from your boss to you. And that's different from just having better conditions.
But part of that question, of the way I heard it, and it was long, I apologize in advance in there, I missed this, but was if, in the way that you put it, there's a kind of way of power, but power in the workplace. And I've been thinking about this because Zach has brought up this issue of, but clearly there are many, many workplaces within the industry, and they're internationally articulated. And then I thought the point that you brought up, and also I think Devin, about there's the political dimension. Who brought up there's a way in which the politics seems to.
I think it was Randy and I.
Yeah, that the politics seems to be a way which, the politics itself, that when it tries to make itself political, there's a blockage. But Randy, is there a kind of, when you talked about an ecosystem of tactics, are politics part of that? Or is it kind of like, is your vision that it needs to sort of, if it doesn't come out of the workplace and sort of like at that level, then it really will undermine itself?
Well, how do you define politics?
Yeah, sure. We can take it there.
Yeah. Well, I feel like I need a working definition to answer that question.
How the workplaces would add up to something more than the sum of their parts. Like, that they're not simply, sectional particular interests, that they have like they become societal in scope maybe.
Right. I don't know if I have a clear answer to that, right? Because I think all the solutions we need to develop are going to be local and situational solutions. And so it's hard when you zoom out. Like, it'll be different, but I don't think it'll be one thing, right? I don't believe in things that we have in the IWW, like the Haggerty's wheel, that, we, the IWW, will be the government now. But I do think organizing by industry is helpful, and bringing back some of those tactics we're not supposed to do, like striking on behalf of someone else's workplace and boycotting. I think boycotts have become really defanged in the digital age. That, like, Burgerville called for their boycott on Twitter. And even, their parent union is the IWW, and even within, like, IWW branches in the Pacific Northwest, where this Burgerville action is happening, we were unclear at every stage, like, are we supposed to be eating at Burgerville or no? I don't really know, because the way that we're doing those tactics is so altered by the way that we're communicating.
Thank you. Anybody else want to take this question up from Steve?
I would kind of like to. I'm not so sure about the trade unions part. I would definitely need to look into more research on that. But I do think that, when it comes to the workplace area and making sure that it is a place where people do want to work, breaks and an environment that is like where the power is taken from the boss or CEO or whatever and put into the people, or there is a boss who has minor control that is working with the people in that corporation, is how we can move forward in making and create a domino effect where all corporations can start doing this. I mean, once we see that progress has started and there are little things that are working, other corporations are going to get ideas to do the same thing, because we are a very competitive society. And if one place has a workforce that is getting paid more and workers are getting treated better, then their competition, workers from that competition, are going to want to work at this place rather than this place. And so I think that we can do things like this and expand our mindset and policy about the workplace, then, we can actually see solutions. On top of that, I think that, socialist movements like DSA, although, it's a good organization, there isn't a lot of follow through with things, and it's not a very organized community. And so if we, work together as socialists, and work with our work rather than our differences, but our collectiveness with IWW, PSL, Pacific Greens, the Progressive Party, and create like a big platform rather than canceling all of each other's ideas out. We can overpower capitalism.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, please.
yeah. So if I understand the question right, and it's getting at how can we expand and kind of transform our efforts to extend beyond the workplace and create some societal transformation. Well, I would say Randy talked about the role of like kind of unconventional unions, tenants unions, buskers unions, all sorts of like these unconventional spaces for organization. I think that's a really powerful tool and practice that can be used to challenge existing power structures. I think, a lot of the work that unions do most effectively today in America is lobbying, right? And that kind of advocacy outside of the workplace, I think is a really powerful tool as well. And it's one that has good pre-existing structures in place. I think, the experience of unionizing can reframe and give clarity to our social relations, right, in a way that can have a transformational effect, right? If you are striking and you see the police called upon you, acting as agents of the state on behalf of capital, that really reframes your understanding of the working of power in society and class interests and intersections of or tensions between certain working populations. And then I also think that unions provide a potential, I hate to use it because this is kind of cribbed from the corporate vocabulary of Starbucks, but it can provide us a third place, some place that's not work and is not home, to build new forms of social solidarity and connections. And so, the union hall is an incredible recreational space as well as an organizational space. And so I think those are ways that industrial or trade unions both could play a transformational role in society at large.
In the back.
Hi. I just wanted to piggyback off of this question because I'm not a panelist, but I have my contribution to the idea. Is that I guess in terms of the dream, like what are we all working towards? So I really like the ecosystem. I think I'm more of networks, I guess, but the ecosystem idea of these interlocking organizations of people that are working towards societal change. So it's not just Starbucks workers, just influencing their workplace and their work hours, etc. As incredibly daunting as this idea is at this common time, eventually the networks can start interlocking and moving towards general strikes, and then those people aren't just striking for, let's say, working conditions. It'll be to basically push all elected officials that you either we demand these changes or we're going to shut the city down. And then every single major city is going to shut down the country unless the elected officials make these laws. And that sounds like a million miles away, unfortunately, but that's my vision of what I'm trying to aim towards it feels like climbing Mount Everest.
What are your thoughts? I was struck by Devin's thought of we need to all be pulling in the same direction, that all these groups would have to sort of form, or we would have different unions in some, but it does raise the question of earlier there was the Socialist Party that also I think about Eugene Debs, who was at the founding of the IWW in 1905, and how that was sparked, where did it, how did it tumble in? But it was kind of like the Russian Revolution of 1905 worldwide had this effect where workers, displayed acts of disobedience to the state in a large way. Do you feel, listening to that question, do you feel that we're climbing the mountain? With the Starbucks organizing, the Amazon organizing, the what's going on in the present in post-pandemic, there's a ascendant trajectory, or do you feel that it's actually quite a ways at the base of the mountain? There's a lot to still be worked out. Do you have feelings on this?
I mean, this goes back to what you and I talked about at Interzone. I think we're reclimbing the mountain. I think, the early labor movement did a lot, and we are having the chance now to learn from those mistakes, but maybe get to that same pre-Wagner Act level of the multiple general strikes. And maybe this time we won't accept any appeasement measures from the state because we did that last time.
Zach, do you have any feel?
Yeah, no, I mean, I certainly share your aspiration that, building the unity of purpose and the cohesion to achieve a general strike is certainly like the dream. I think that we should be realistic about what it can achieve, right? There are countries around the world that are very effectively able to mobilize, mass segments of their working class in mass strikes. And we've also seen that there are limitations to what those can accomplish, right? So we should be realistic with our expectations as well. When we're asking, what are we working toward? I think that's a really good question. And for me, it's empowerment, right? I don't think we can articulate the ends for the working class, right? We need to allow workers to articulate their own interests and demands. They know it well. And I think the kind of vanguardist impulse to have the hand on the tiller and constantly push, the union movement to the radical ends that you think is the ultimate, purpose is a really destructive, counterproductive tendency within some strains of leftist organizers. So when we're thinking about our ultimate ends and what we're working toward, I would say power and giving voice to the workers.
Devin, do you have anything to add?
No, you covered it very well. Yeah.
I guess maybe where do you feel we are on the mountain climbing journey?
Not even close to the top. I think we need to continue pushing, and it's probably going to take a while. But we also need to think of what are we going to do when we get to the top of that mountain, and how do we stay on the top of that mountain so we don't fall again and have to reclimb our journey.
Okay. You still have a question?
So I still have a question.
You'll be next.
Yeah, Randy, who distinguished between industrial unions and trade unions. Could you clarify what you mean by the distinction?
Yeah, of course. So a trade is the thing you do, right? So if you're a waiter and you joined a trade union, it would be like servers union. Versus if you joined an industrial union, it would be a food service union. It would include front of house, it would include back of house, it would include the guy who brings you produce, everyone who works in that entire industry, maybe even like grocery stores. It's everyone, and it avoids having situations like my friend who works at Pixar. There was a union at that workplace, but it was an artist union, and she was a technical director, so she can't be in the union because it's not her trade, it's not the thing she does. Even though she was working, like all of her coworkers were unionized, and she wasn't allowed to be in that union. And so that's what we try to avoid in the IWW.
Yeah, I'm curious where the panelists see unionization efforts with like long-term revolutionary goals. Is unionizing a workplace a step towards true workplace democracy? Or, because to me it seems like unionization becomes a redundancy with an actual, worker-owned means of production. So do you think that the unionized process can be skipped and the workplace can just be taken into the hands of the workers themselves and management basically just told to fuck off? Or is unionization a necessary step to achieving a socialist economy? And is that really, where do you guys, I guess, feel like of the top of that mountain is? I mean, is this kind of a true communism or some other revolutionary goal?
Great question.
So I certainly think unionization is the first step. I don't think we can definitely skip that. I don't believe that there is a way that we can cooperate with the corporations and get what we need without unionization. And unionization also holds, an accountability to those corporations and reinstalls the people power in those corporations.
Just to add a point, I think the idea was that, do you actually need the unions if you have organized power in the workplace? Why do you need the organization?
Yeah, basically, does it become a redundancy if, my understanding of socialism, the core of it would be worker control, like a democratic workplace, where there is no management. It's a cooperative sort of environment where a union is more or less, in the capital system, is a great tool to give workers a voice against management, but it exists in a contrast to management, doesn't necessarily have the goal of eroding the power dynamic as it stands.
I think unions should have that goal. And
Right.
I would say if you got together, and did that is a union, so.
Right.
Zach, how do you view this question in terms of unions as being redundant? In some ways, I guess the sense is that maybe we have our purposes in building unions is in some ways misguided.
Sort of, or just as a. I mean, I'm definitely very pro-union, but there is almost this acknowledgement of the capital system. When you do this, if unionization is just your main thing, as opposed to an idea of a truly democratically run economy, right? Like the Paracon thing, or whatever you want to call it. I think there's what the left is. That gets kind of it. The idea is how to organize the economy in a way that isn't this brutal neoliberal hellscape.
Yeah, I think my vision for the ultimate ends of what are we bargaining for is sort of that Richard Wolff democracy at work transition to a worker-led, worker-owned cooperative. As to what is the role of a union in that cooperative, is it redundant? The questions of bureaucracy and management, even within a worker-led and owned shop, are complicated, right? And having a body representing the workers on the floor might still be virtuous. And I think also as we grow, if we get to the point where these relationships are where this model of workplace organization is growing and expanding, I think we might see a need for some form of union or associations to exist to mediate the relationships between these kind of syndicalist shops, right? And then adopt the role of more social allocation of production.
Great. At the back.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of the talk. I was curious what the panelists thought about the John Robinson quote at the top of the event flyer about the misery of being exploited by capitalists being nothing compared to the misery of being exploited by no one.
Excellent point. So this Joan Robinson quote that we dug up to frame the panel. That the misery of working under capitalism is nothing compared to the misery of not being employed. Did I get it right? Not being exploited at all. Okay, yeah.
Same.
But that's the meaning behind it, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm going to be honest, I didn't really comprehend the quote. I just looked at it and said, "Oh, cool, that's right," and moved on. Maybe I should have looked into it.
So I imagine she's talking about the pain of not being exploited at all under a capitalist society, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, naturally, if we had a more emancipatory future, I would take not being exploited under an emancipatory society under being exploited under capitalism any day. I don't think that's what she's saying, right?
I remember being in a union that went through the austerity of the 1980s and gave up concessions left, right, because they feared that the workplace would lose workers. And so, the fear of casting some of your brothers and sisters into unemployment was kind of like, may have given up power, like even in terms of like the meager labor relations, or even like bartered away for the possibility of maybe holding on to jobs.
Yeah, I think that trend of concessionary bargaining in the 80s and 90s was incredibly damaging. And if we do need anything, we need militant fighting unions. I think that's what's really called on today. But I think that when we organize, we need to be conscious that the strength that the bosses hold is exactly that fear of unemployment, right? And so I do think there is some verity in that statement, right? And certainly for a worker, the empowerment that they experience being part of a union movement will not overwhelm their insecurity that comes when they're unjustly fired by their workers. So I think that's important to learn, and I think the lesson that I kind of take from that is empathy, right? Empathy for your coworkers, and that's why it's so important to place leadership in the hands of the workers. It's because they have the greatest sensitivity and are best able to manage that tension.
Randy, did you have a response to the quote, or when you read it, did you have a...
I understood it, I think, differently from how it was meant to be understood, right? So I was thinking of it more through the lens of our many conceptions of what work is, right? When I say I worked hard on this dress I made for my niece, I don't mean the same thing as, oh, I'm off to work right now. Like, it's the same word, but vastly different contexts. So I don't think you're going to stop like human activity. We're going to be productive. It's one of the things we always want to do is like develop either technology or like social structures, right? We're going to do things. So I don't think this threat of, I viewed it more in this automation context, in this threat of what will we do if we're not working? We'll work.
Audrey.
I guess I'd like to comment on this aspect of not being exploited at all. The reason people fear and are horrified of unemployment is not because they don't get to go to work 8 hours a day. It's because of all the rights and privileges in society that they're giving up, like the right to have a home or be able to buy food or recreate. So it's not the exploitation that they miss, but it's the idea of not losing income. And so I think that I think along with the idea that work has to change, we have to change what is society's responsibility to its members. That access to healthcare, to housing, to food, to education, those things should be guaranteed in society regardless of whether someone is working or not. And I think that would relieve this fear of unemployment. And I think I think we as a society we have kind of a mistaken idea about work. And I think it's because we've found for maybe the last 10,000 years, maybe longer, we found the more work we do, the better off we are. But I think we're reaching a point where the more work we do, the more resources we're destroying, and the more we're ruining the possibility that humans continue to live on Earth. And so I think we have to have a whole different concept of work, and then we need to be talking not about the rights of people to have jobs, but the rights of people to have access to those resources that are needed to lead a good life in our society.
Great, thanks, Mike. The one thing that I was thinking when Mike said this, there is, you may have different perspectives on how society may, provide. I mean, I think Mike brought up the case of, healthcare in the state, but maybe you have different conceptions about how society would provide these, and how the movement of the working class, working class movements might be part of how society provides basic needs. I was thinking with Randy, my sense is that you're very critical of, the welfare, the kind of compact of progressivism. That, the IWW in some ways is, has a different vision than that. But I'm not sure, and with Devin, I'm not sure if that's sympathetic. That seems to be, something that you seem to be hearkening on, like, we need the state to be able to supply these basic needs, so that if you're in this situation where you're not being exploited and by capitalists, that the state will support you in some ways. And Zach, I'm a little less clear on how you would respond to this.
I guess my thought on this usually is, does an organization that does those things, that manages the logistics of getting people what they need, necessarily equate to a state, right? Like, I'm not against a well-ordered and organized society. I just want that society to be well-ordered and organized, but also democratic and just. Like, I don't think those things need to be separate.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with Randy. Those things shouldn't be separate. But we also agree with Mike. Those things should be provided by the state, or whatever you would categorize the state as. Because, quite frankly, it's its job to better the people's.
Okay. Zach, do you have any thoughts on this?
Really resonate what you said with me. That resonates with me. I think I do feel some skepticism that the provisioning of services by the government is often not done in the interest of the public good. My concern with transitioning those services away from like a state function is that, does this essentially become a subsidization of, public welfare that is being put on, an additional burden that's being put on the working class structures. And given the capacity that we have right now in our numbers, can we adopt such a burden? So I guess that's my only thoughts around that issue.
Yeah, and if I can add on to that, I would just agree that the state is who has the power to do it right now, and it would be good if they did it right now.
Absolutely.
Like, in an ideal society, you maybe wouldn't want the state to do it, but I'm definitely not against those things being enacted by the state sort of immediately, especially things like UBI that make organizing so much easier.
Okay, thanks. Audrey, and then the gentleman over there.
Yeah, I was going to say, also actually to Mike's point about the Joan Robinson quote, work is a drag, and most people probably don't like it, even if you have like a white-collar job or whatever. But I think most people think that work is like wrapped up in their identities, and if they don't feel like they can be useful in society, then it feels sort of there's a hole there for people. And so it seems like Joan Robinson, who's not a Marxist, she was more of a Keynesian, but she was still getting at like a basic point that I guess used to be common sense for people on the left, particularly the Marxist left, obviously, which is that the problem in capitalism is not that like the bosses are greedy or not treating us according to our bourgeois rights and equality so much as there's like an issue with like living labor being devalued in industrial production, which is more of a social problem, a problem for our social relations, right? But we need to evolve past that. And so it seems to me like the syndicalist idea historically that, shop floor solidarity is sort of like socialism in Euro, and that eventually, if it reached a big enough point, the mass strike, that you could sort of naturally evolve to socialism without the party question, without the sort of like problematic political issue, then, that seems to contradict what Marxists historically thought, which is that there's this broader social issue of living labor being devalued in industrial production, that you would need to have a political revolution first in order to allow society to evolve past our bourgeois rights of labor. And it just seems like unionizing, it seems like it's like fighting for bourgeois rights of labor, which is a noble pursuit in that it seems like we are denied those rights. But it's just that Marxists kind of considered that the motor that keeps capitalism going rather than its solution. And so I would just say, like, I mean, I know there's a lot there, but like, what would you guys say about the syndicalist notion that we're sort of naturally evolving towards socialism? If socialism is like, you know, shop floor solidarity or worker control, you know, democratic production or something. Because arguably we have that now. We have a worker controlled industry now. It's just some workers are managers, some workers are CEOs, right? Like everyone is essentially kind of this, you know, fungible in uniform in that way. Just they're maybe not morally responsible for what they have to do. It's just kind of a social coercion. Anyway, I know there's a lot there, but any little part of it I respond to.
I feel like I'm the impulsive one in the group. I always want to jump in. I would align a lot with what you presented as sort of the syndicalist idea, but add onto it sort of the mutualist idea of a revolution in the hearts and the minds of the people, right? Like a lot of what you're talking about is more like social and identity and meta-narrative based, and I think that can be a complement to this sort of shop floor syndicalist style organizing without necessarily having a change in the explicit like politics or relationship to the state.
What about this? I mean, this question of the way in which worker, the working class. One could, point out that there are people who might say that, for example, and this is not directed at you, Randy, but you've had some points that have sort of like become a focusing point for this conversation. But the labor relations framework, in some ways, was the product of working class movements and unions making demands out of the 30s, and that the working class demands are kind of bound up with how capitalism may evolve or change. How does it not be that? How does it become about something that goes beyond? And I guess the syndicalist response is that we're doing it we're building power on the ground, and that will spread through society. Is that the only kind of? Syndicalism is old now. It's been around for a long time, and anyways, any more thoughts? I just wanted to focus Audrey's. Well, just to add on to Audrey's question, I want to make sure it gets taken up.
Sorry, I'm just breathing. Sorry, was that? Sounded like about to speak.
It could be. I was really struck by your comment, Zach, about how maybe in the present, it's still resonating, your opening remarks about maybe we're missing opportunities. Maybe technology and sort of the circumstances have created more pinch points in society through which to kind of disrupt society. But it goes unanswered in some ways. I took from your opening remarks that there's a kind of, you're aware of like potential and possibility that doesn't sort of manifest. And, but I wonder where all that disruption leads to. Like, how do you see this disruption? If it were grasped, if we could, every pinch point, like the actual supply crisis was provoked by workers instead of some kind of who knows what's going on. How would that open up possibilities for maybe overcoming these deeper problems with labor, and unemployment, and kind of taking control of society somehow? What would it do?
Yeah, it's these really big questions, and having trouble kind of breaking them down into a digestible piece. And I don't want to mischaracterize what all the things that you were putting out. I guess I guess one thing that struck me was you were talking about that in many ways we're responding to like social relations, right? And a feeling of like being in a lack of dignity and worth in work and things like that. And I don't know that those social relations can be separated out from their the economic relations, right? Like that workers are perceived as being disposable because they're treated as disposable units through their workplace, right? And that filters into our social perception about the self-worth and dignity of those workers. So I think that's one, is that that incorporating the economic transformation is a really key part of developing the social transformation. And as to like, the contradiction or the tension between being maybe like a stabilizing force in capitalism, I think, these things, the transition from feudalism to capitalism wasn't an abrupt transition, right? It wasn't, it didn't happen one day, right? That we left feudalism and we entered a capitalist mode of production, a capitalist society, right? And I don't think we should expect new historical epochs to follow a kind of like abrupt revolutionary pattern. I think we should think about it in more gradual ways in which, systems that resist capitalism can cohabitate within that function, right, and undermine it from within. And I think we see this not only with economics. I think we also see that people are capable of challenging dominant social orders from within the rules, the values, the mores of that society. And so I don't think working within those frameworks should be necessarily condemned as being collaborative or concessionary.
Could I ask you to elaborate on this idea of like everyone being in uniform? Are you sort of talking about the idea that most people have something like a wage or a salary, even if you're the CEO, that, as a CEO, you're setting your salary and everyone else's, but it still looks like a wage and it complicates the Marxist framework because we sort of, I was supposed to say perform class differently now than we did when Marx was writing, but I'm sure there's a better way to phrase that.
Yeah, well, exactly though, what do you need that clarification on? Because I was actually going to say also, and this could apply to you too, to everyone, when you say that people are treated without dignity in the workplace, and obviously we don't need to offer any evidence that any of us who's had, any kind of job, especially a low wage job, we all know what this is, but is that, how would you problematize that? Is that the product of ill will on the part of people in charge, or is there something else at play where the people in charge are sort of compelled to engage in some level of austerity that harms workers, their hands tied? Like, is it a moral issue? Is it the people in charge are immoral, Or is it something else?
I am not familiar with what syndicalism is, so I don't think I'm best fit to answer this question. Unless you can give me like a summarized version of what it would be.
Yeah, well, we don't need to get into it. I just brought that up because I was thinking of I was thinking of labor organizing, whatever, it goes in different order. But the idea that people organize in workplaces, that you don't necessarily need a political party or a political revolution, that if you have enough workplaces organized and it's worker run and industry becomes worker run, that you could essentially just shut down the economy if you want to, or it's sort of like the idea is that the workers are reclaiming the means of production, and then they can sort of direct themselves according to whatever vision they see fit, which in this case the implication would be a socialist society. But what is the nature of that socialist society if Marx has problematized the issue of labor as it's bourgeois labor rights to be treated with dignity, have high pay, et cetera, but then we're not afforded those rights, not because people are immoral, but because industrial production devalues living labor, and that's like a bigger problem than just workers taking over industry. Yeah, so.
Let's let that.
Yeah, but
Wait, well, let's. Do you need to let it sit a bit, or?
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, we've got a question at the back. We've got Tony, and then we've got Eric, and then let's go to online for just. We're gonna go to the person that. Are you okay? Okay, online. They've been waiting for a while.
I was gonna ask my own. This
Oh, yeah,
one's a
okay.
little long, but we can just go to these ones first, maybe.
All right, so let's go to the back corner there. Yes.
On the panel, I've been hearing a bunch of what sounds like 1950s solutions to 21st century problems. I'm curious for the various panelists, how do you propose to organize employees when a corporation increasingly no longer has employees? They've all been, through various legalistic maneuvers, turned into independent contractors, and now they're gig workers, and now they technically don't exist as employees. As an Uber driver, I experienced this because I was working 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, wound up making $5 an hour. And in 2005, there were 16% of the US workforce was doing this gig work, which is basically far below the minimum wage. The minimum wage goes away for independent contractors. Now it's up to 36%. How are we going to deal with this when it gets to 80%, 90%?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the task of organizing these misclassified workers, these independent contractors, people that are classified that way, it's a massive and emerging challenge. I think that conventional union structures actually can provide a lot of support for workers in these industries to circumvent some of the legalistic hurdles that they're facing in trying to gain better conditions in their employment. And I think that there's some interesting empirical case studies that we can turn to and look at this, right? A few years ago, lobster fishermen in Maine who are self-employed, independent contractors, were facing tremendous market pressure, and the industry was facing collapse essentially. And when they threatened work stoppage in an attempt to buoy prices and raise prices, the state attorney general threatened a class action lawsuit against them for forming an illegal monopoly. And the response was that these lobstermen drew on personal connections, that they had family connections with workers at the Bath Iron Works in Portland, East Portland. And the machinists union there came together and brought their technical know-how, their legal resources, their lobbying experience, and they provided tools and strategies for circumventing some of these things, right? Like in that case, they made a marketing cooperative. They helped them form a marketing cooperative, statewide marketing cooperative, to circumvent the threat of that injunction on an illegal strike. So I think that traditional unions, with the immense resources that they have, the legal know-how, the lobbying networks, can actually do a lot to lend support to independent workers as they're trying to negotiate these struggles.
Any other thoughts on, we're kind of skirting around the issue of how work has changed, and is continuing to accelerate its change in terms of how people are organized?
Yeah, most of these indie contract workers are going through such a churn that they're there for maybe 2 months or more. Amazon right now is looking at the problem of running out of people in America to hire because they burn through so many people so fast. How do you organize people like that?
Yeah, so I think that last bit is the important question, is how do you do it, right? Because I think the strategy remains the same, but the tactics always have to change depending on the particulars of the current moment and how work works. For instance, we've moved back and forth in the Mid-Valley IWW between a model of sort of agitation as our emotional core, where you get people riled up and you're like, hey, fuck Jeff Bezos. Am I right? Versus affirmation as the emotional core, because in some other situations, I think a big thing right now is getting people to acknowledge that there's a problem in the first place. Be like, no, your concerns aren't silly, they're not small, and you're not the only one having them. Because, I would agree with the Marxists that capitalism forces people to start viewing themselves as atomized individuals, and that makes bringing out some of these issues difficult. It's a little bit tangential to what you said, but I guess my summary is I'm hopeful that we can find ways of organizing. I don't think it's unorganizable. I just think your tactics need to be different.
I would agree with Randy, and I would like to touch up on a point that they made. And, I think it is a lot about political education, making sure that those workers understand that, what is going on and what they're thinking and what they want to do is, not silly. And it is like, they need to understand that, these are actual issues and that there are ways that we can solve them. And that if we collectively work together, we can solve those problems and make sure that, corporate greed and people like Jeff Bezos aren't, overworking and underpaying their workers.
Okay, thank you. Great question. We've got, we're sort of coming towards the end here. So Tony, Eric, and Will, and anybody online if there's a question.
Steve has one more, yeah.
Okay, well, let's start with Tony.
I like the emphasis on stories. My understanding, at least in Europe, about how the working class developed is that the commons were enclosed by the aristocracy. And so then you had all these people who had been fairly self-reliant as communities, not to romanticize that, but had been fairly self-reliant as communities, and had a historical memory of that. And now they became the new working class in the industrial towns, or they were sent to the so-called New World to colonize, right? So from the very beginning of the labor movement, what I see as an important theme is the liberation of time. Who owns your time? And defining how your own creativity and life energies are used. So capitalism gives you this big machine and everybody's fitted into a slot, and we know that millions and millions of people have died without fulfilling their potential, using their creativity in ways they might have chosen, or that their community might have embraced and nurtured them. So I think these are some of the bigger issues about being caught within that capitalist paradigm that have to do with the devaluing of labor. And I don't know, I guess my question is do you all see that as a kind of long-term goal, that once we are in power, there's ways we can decide collectively and democratically how to reorganize the division of labor, for instance, or how to create technologies that aren't capitalist technologies, because a lot of technology has been created within this paradigm. So it's about control, for instance, or efficiency to make profits.
Great question,
I'll
Tony.
stop there.
Yeah, no, that's good.
I would say yes, absolutely. For our organization in particular, and I'm hoping the rest of the panelists as well. And when it comes to like the capitalist technology as a point you touched on, I think that, if you look back, the Soviet Union is not the best example, but it is an example to use when we think of like industrial revolution and technology. They were the first ones to put something in outer space, and they did that successfully and in a short amount of time. And so I don't think capitalism or communism or socialism determines how well we can produce something. It's all about, who's more educated and creative in doing so, and how much are we pouring in to fund those resources. And on top of that, when you said, what do we do when we come into control? We don't want to do it. We shouldn't do the same thing as the current two-party duopoly does. We don't want to have a system, for example, where Republicans are in control and then Democrats are elected and they just reverse everything that Republicans do, but don't push their initiatives forward. Once we get in control, even if we don't agree with something that happened in the previous, system, we still need to push our initiatives forward. So we're not just sitting there reversing another party's whatever.
I was talking about this earlier today with respect to my robotics research, because I do agricultural robotics and I work on selective harvesting. So having robots pick apples is really what my project is focused on. And the landscape there is, so people who work all day picking apples develop diseases from having to pick apples all day, right? So the only solution is way more people picking fewer apples apiece, which is really hard to organize a society around. Like when you start doing the math, it's more people than have ever worked in agriculture by percentage at a time if we're doing like this small amount of food harvest each. And so the other option is make a robot do it, right? So I see a lot of areas where it's just in the best interest of people's health and well-being. But it's tough as a robotics researcher to get money to make the lives of apple pickers better, right? Like your pitch always has to be, you could pick so many apples with this thing, it'll make money. And so a lot of like the people I know who are trying to do ethical work, they always have to sort of do it sneakily. And that's an interesting landscape.
Yeah, I think, anyone that has, an emancipatory goal, that they're working toward, I think it's necessary to exercise your kind of radical imagination, right? Envision the world that you're trying to build toward, and then develop a practical, pragmatic plan to achieve those goals, right? But at the same time, I think the state that we are in as a working class is so vulnerable, so fragile, that we really need to focus more on finding our voice, right? And building that empowerment. And that I worry that a lot of these questions can kind of be a little navel-gazy, right? And that's why I said, right, once we find our collective voice, then we can turn to the task of articulating what our ultimate demands are. And certainly it's productive and good work to do that radical imagining and think of ways forward, but I don't know that we need to center that necessarily, because not every worker is at the point where they have an emancipatory goal.
Thank you so much. Okay, Eric, Will, and then Steve, you will have...
So this kind of goes to both your kind of branding the concept of what a union is and then your Zach's idea of like a missed opportunity. I work at a large retail box store, and kind of going back to what Audrey was saying, a lot of the lower level management at my, where I work, are themselves more or less exploited workers, especially the non-salaried, the wage workers. It's only the top management, and even them are, I often see them doing just regular wage, doing regular labor. And they're not the one, it's not, and I know this is sort of heretical towards sort of unionism, but they're not, the bosses, especially my immediate bosses, aren't the ones setting the agenda. So, would it be possible to go about organizing lower level management? I realize that kind of goes against traditional unionism, but that's sort of, this is sort of something that hasn't worked. And even the manager doesn't really dictate, a lot of what, are the hours we get, the amount of hours that they're allowed to schedule it isn't up to the manager of the particular place at work. It's up to corporate. They send it down, like, this is the number of hours you get to, employ people this month. So, I mean, it kind of goes to that, like, who's setting the agenda, like the boss, or even the corporation, or capitalism itself, and how, it, and kind of going back to the idea of more, the morality. I mean, the particular bosses I deal with aren't doing what they do because they're immoral or because there's anything bad. They're just doing what they have to do. And especially, like I would say, the wage, the ones who have to, punch in, they're basically as exploited as I am. And, so how could you possibly see organizing even that? Which I realize is kind of illegal, when it comes to unionism, but that's sort of my contribution.
Yeah, I would agree really strongly with that. I mean, I think many of us are kind of habituated into thinking the employing class and the working class have nothing in common, right? This is such a central part of our texts and our thinking. But certainly, I can tell you at Starbucks that I feel that the class interests of the general managers and the workers are far more aligned, right, than the interests of the general managers and Howard Schultz, right? So. I certainly agree with you there, and I think we've seen some very courageous managers actually jeopardize their job security either by refusing to implement union busting tactics that have been put on them by higher echelon managers, or leaking damaging information, kind of exposing the union busting. Like you said, National Labor Relations Act is really an insuperable barrier when it comes to organizing these workers because they just fall outside of the bargaining unit. For us, it was more relational, right? It was communicating that this wasn't necessarily hostility toward you or personal animus, right? That this was a fight to empower us and to gain a voice and to have equality at the table. Gosh, I'm sorry. I wish I had something more insightful, but I really agree. But I do agree that those class interests.
Some of the people I work with, not all of them. I mean, some of the managers, lower managers, are, I don't. Like, if I were to try to organize a union, that's like the same sense I would have. It's like, oh man, I don't want to. Like, I would want to organize for my rights, but I don't. How would one not, especially a lot of the fellow workers probably don't have a lot of dislike for their, lower management.
Yeah, like general management is not the employing class, right? I have friends who are managers at retail stores and they can't afford to move out of their parents' homes, much less employ someone. And I guess I would need a more nuanced understanding of labor law to know whether they can be in your union and just not in your illegal entity that the US government is recognizing as a union. But like Zach said, you can get them on board. I would get them on board early in a union campaign if you can.
But there, you could, I'm not, I used to be a wobbly, and I left because I just didn't pay my dues. Not because I didn't problem, but you couldn't give a red card to any management, correct?
You can, as long as they don't have higher firepower. If your manager can fire you, they can't have a red card. But there's lots of people whose job title is manager who can still be in the IWW.
Devin, do you have any thoughts or?
I do not.
Okay.
I would like to talk with you more and try to understand, because that's something I'd like to look into because I don't have an answer for that.
Okay, well, we'll have an opportunity afterwards. Will, your question?
My two questions are pretty similar to Steve and Aaron in the chat.
Great.
Similar questions. So Aaron's question was, how can socialists at a local level begin organizing unions that won't just be filtered into the Democratic Party? And so I was interested in you, Devin, because in your introduction, talked about wanting to have some type of left coalition independent of the Democrats, but with labor politics sometimes demanding a higher wage or better working conditions, you have, the Democratic Party and capitalist politicians who echo those same sentiments. So, how do you distinguish yourself from them is one question. And then another question, more specifically for Zach, I guess there's this general idea that this is coming from Steve, that struggles in the workplace could lead to more lessons and basically can widen onto more societal issues, starting with the workplace. But in Steve's experience as a minor, he's seen that without a broader political outlook, those lessons aren't often learned. And so you talked about vanguardism earlier, and you said you have some problems with that. And Lenin famously said that the working class on their own could only achieve trade union consciousness. So I'm just wondering, how does the working class sort of navigate capitalist politics without political leadership and without a political party today?
Go ahead. So, in answer to the first question of how can socialists build a union that's not affiliated with pre-existing parties, it's really simple. Get on the job and organize, man. That's the beginning and the end of it. And we're living in a really exciting time where we have an independent union movement that's growing, and we're seeing new models of how workers can associate and build power outside of the pre-existing structures and affiliations. So. And I think you might be surprised with how much support you get from establishment unions in building that independent union. As for the second, in terms of political leadership, I just very strongly believe that we do need to be explicitly political in our intentions and our goals, but that we need to ensure that those political goals arise organically from the indigenous workforce, right, and are expressive of their interests. Maybe that doesn't answer sufficiently, but
just to put a point on it, what if the organic interest is to vote for Democrats?
Well,
yeah,
then
it's okay.
All right.
Yeah.
I think we might find sometimes that the organic interests are far more reactionary than that. We should be honest about it. And
okay.
Yeah.
Could you repeat the first question again?
The first question was basically
the question from Aaron, so it's fresh in my brain.
Oh, okay. How can socialists at a local level begin organizing unions that won't just be filtered into the Democratic Party? And then I sort of added on top of that, having similar demands, like higher wages, better working conditions. How do you navigate that?
I'd say, like I said earlier, we need to collectively come together as socialist groups and find what we have in common and work together on political education within the workforce to push forward that initiative and let workers know what we're doing, what we're living in right now is obscene and disgusting. And a second part of that is, I would say, giving 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote. That's an initiative we're working on right now with State Representative broaden. 16 and 17-year-old Gen Z and millennials have shown to be the most anti-capitalist and pro-union generations out of all of them that we've polled, which would help that initiative to get those unions and detach from the Democratic Party and let people understand that liberalism isn't the best solution and that socialism is what we need to push forward to.
Randy, I was thinking earlier when you were asked a question about politics, it's what do you mean by politics? And so here it's kind of posed very clearly is if the demands, if the IWW's demands line up with the demands, political demands from the Democratic Party, how would you distinguish, or would you, or how does that work?
Well, a lot of thoughts about the Democratic Party that complicate that, because people use left-wing rhetoric for a variety of reasons, and it's not always to advance left-wing causes. So I would be distrustful of the Democratic Party is the real answer to that. I also disagree with Lenin that people left to themselves will develop a trade union consciousness instead of a class consciousness, especially because of the things we see with young people overwhelmingly citing capitalism as the issue, and things we saw in the early labor movement of when people were mistreated at work. A lot of that political propaganda was like, hey, capitalism sucks. I think all you really need to do to get to a socialist consciousness is think about your situation for a second. I think there's a lot of things that are stopping people from fully realizing that consciousness that are sort of external. So I'd say it's not you need to instill class consciousness in people, you need to remove the barriers that are keeping them from realizing that class consciousness that's probably already lingering somewhere in the back of their mind. So like, I've talked to people who are really on board with things that are very socialist until you start using the word socialism or union, until you touch on something that's part of the culture war, and then they recoil, right? But I don't think you need to go and explain the problem to them. People know what the problem is.
Mm-hmm. I can't like emphasize, 100%. And, maybe I would trust Lenin more if he didn't murder so many industrial unionists at Kronstadt that had revolutionary consciousness. So, fuck him.
I would like to touch on what Randy said about being cautious of the Democratic Party. I think the Democratic Party as a whole we should be cautious of, but there are candidates who are trying to push the party towards more progressive socialism. Oregon's own Doyle Canning, who lost the Democratic primary against Val Hoyle, she is a very known democratic socialist, and if we have more people like that pushing the Democratic Party to a socialist party, that could help our cause. But as Nancy Pelosi said, talking to a college student who asked her, how do Democrats cope with Gen Z and millennials seeing socialism as the party to be, she blatantly said that the Democratic Party is a capitalist party, and so that is something to be cautious of.
Fantastic. Well, did we miss anything? Everything they wanted to say, you had an opportunity to? Okay, well, let's round of applause for our thanks so much. On your way out, I know Tony has brought some literature. I know Mike has some pamphlets, and take as many of those platypus reviews as you can carry. We'd love to.
Did you put IWW cards back there?
Oh.
So I've got a stack of them.
Yes.
They're there?
No.
Oh, sick. All right, I'll put these back there.
The last thing is, if you have any thoughts about the panel, like if you go away and you're thinking about it and you would like to write it out and put it and submit it to the platypus review, they're on the back, there's a submission. We love having reflections. If something sort of strongly you had a response to, please do so. I think we are gonna, I'm not sure if anybody's interested, but I was thinking of, unless there's a zoo over there, going to American Dream and then having a little informal talk with the panel. But thank you so much for your time and addressing all of these questions and your thoughts and your reflections. All right.
Thanks for putting it together.